You're listening to the Writera podcast, the show that helps authors share their book and fascinating stories. Here's your host, Mary Crawford.
Hello there, this is Mary from Writera, where we talk about wonderful people, fascinating writers, and creative authors. Over here with me is Bill Cushing, and he wants to tell us about his book, The Former Life. Bill, take it away.
Am I coming in? Okay, yeah, great. Well, it's actually the subtitle, I think, says it all pretty much. It's called A Former Life, and then the subtitle on it was, let me make sure I get it right, An Overview of 2 Centuries, 60 Years in the Making. So it basically starts when I'm a kid and goes all the way up to my current life, as much as it was at that point. The book came out about a year and a half ago. But it's a full collection of poetry. It's divided into 3 parts, people, places, and things. I did get some arguments from some reviewers on the things category because they said, well, why are you putting that there? I said, well, I had no other place to put it, so it ended up as for example, my poetry, the poetry on music. I didn't really call that people or place, but that sort of just ended up in the things routine.
I see. Looks like a very, very interesting book. So, tell us what inspired you to write this book.
Well, I've actually been writing poetry now seriously since about 1988, 89. And I had collected all these poems, and I've always had sort of an eye toward writing. And I thought, probably the most publishable material I had at the moment was the poetry. So it was just a matter of organizing it, formatting it, and sending it out and getting it picked up.
So what got you interested to write poetry aside from other book genres?
Well, that's funny because I actually came at it sort of through a back door. When I came out of high school, I was going to be a journalism major, and I was still interested in that. I didn't return to school till I was 38 years old.
Oh, wow.
And when I got back to school, I picked up on the journalism.
Okay.
Although I actually started as a history major when I went back. It was either going to be history or humanities, because I thought journalism's sort of out, just because I'm too old to start all over again. And, a young reporter has to really be energetic. And I was like, but I still joined the school newspaper and worked with them. And we went to a conference, and I attended a workshop called How to Improve Your Writing.
Okay.
And we get in there, and the woman basically says, hey, you want to improve your writing in any medium or any format, start writing poetry. Because it forces you to look at your language, look at your diction, to try and get as much use out of each word as you can. It was the idea of you really learn how to control language in that format, and it carries over in anything else.
Right.
So I basically, at that conference, I wrote my first real poem, because at the time I was out, I used to run, and I was out running around, and I saw one of these old style airfoil diners, and I convinced everybody in the group before we left to go back to school, let's stop off and have breakfast at this place, because no better place than an old 24-hour diner.
Right.
Breakfast. And while I was there, I said, this is the stuff of poetry here. Let me do this. And so I started making some notes, and I wrote this poem, and it's called In Pink Neon. And that was the first real poem I wrote, which is in the book, of course. So.
Interesting. So if this is the first one that you've written, this must be the most special one, isn't it?
one of them, there's a couple of them in there that, and I've got some newer stuff, obviously, but
Mm-hmm.
I wrote one on sailing. I'm very big on sailing. I love it. I've been doing it since I was 5. In
Oh.
fact, that's what I did before I went to school. I was in the Navy.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And then after I got out of the Navy, I continued working on oil tankers pretty much, mostly, and also fishing boats, whatever.
Mm.
Um, but sailing has always been something I loved. And so I write about that in there. Um, Actually, it's kind of funny because I have several religiously themed poems
Mm-hmm.
um, that showed up, and there's one in there that I've always liked, and it's funny because those 3 poems, the pink neon, the sailing, and the religious notes, I've had a lot of success placing them in journals and magazines and that kind of thing. So
Oh,
even though they were early on, they came out pretty well.
clearly you love writing poems. So what for you is poetry?
Oh, that's the one I always love, because here again, I am very big into language. I'm very big into, I'm one of those people that I need to know what I'm talking about. And so when I first started writing, I was like, well, how do you define poetry? I mean, it was because you run into textbooks and interviews, and there's all kinds of definitions. And
Mm.
some of them are good, some of them are not so good. Some of them I say, okay, part of that is good, part of it isn't. The best definition of poetry I actually ran into by accident. I was, at the time I was living in Florida, but I went to Vermont
Mm-hmm.
and I went by train.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'm coming back to Florida and I'm on the Amtrak, and I was reading over some material I had, and this guy next to me is like, oh, you write poetry. And he did too. And we start talking.
Mm-hmm.
And all of a sudden this guy behind us sticks his head up and goes, you guys talking about poetry? And I was like, well, yeah. He says, well, I write too. So we all just started talking about it. And of course, that's always the first, how do you define poetry?
Right.
And the guy behind us, who was from Canada,
Mm-hmm.
I don't remember his name. Obviously, it's been so long ago, but I loved what he said. He said, poetry is it's the history of the human soul. And I said, that's the best definition I've ever heard, bar none.
Mm-hmm.
Because, what is history? It's the recording of events.
Mm-hmm.
And what's the human soul? Well, it's who we are at any given moment. And when you think about it, poetry actually started as history. If you look at the old Greek and that stuff, it was a recording of historical events through poetic devices.
Mm-hmm.
So, and obviously they used hyperbole and metaphor and all that other stuff. I said,
Agreed.
that's the best definition I ever heard. So ever since I said, yeah, poetry is the history of the human soul. So basically each poem sort of reflects not just the moment I'm recording, but how I perceive the moment at that stage in time, given my age and who I am, what I am, all that other stuff. Because I don't know if I'm a big believer in the tabula rasa, which I don't know if you're familiar with that at all, but
Mm-hmm. Yeah, tell me more about tabula rasa.
the tabula rasa is human existence, and meaning, and literally it's blank slate or erased slate. And he says, what you are is the sum total of all your memories, good or bad, up to this point. And it's like writing on a slate. It's, you're born with no memories, no context, no points of reference. And as you go through experiences, you record your reactions to those, and that determines, for example, one of the things I used to tell my students was, and I started as a history major and I love history. I said, how many people thought history was boring? And a lot of them would raise their hands. Like, well, here's the problem. History is not boring. History teachers can be horribly boring.
Yes, I agree.
I was lucky enough when I was growing up that all my history teachers were very good, and they sparked that interest in me. So a lot of, what I prefer and what I don't prefer is more to do with, well, what was my memory of that when I first ran into it? So that's sort of, and if you look at poetry as this, it's not just what I'm seeing, but it's my interpretation of what I'm seeing based on who I am. And that's all determined by what? It's determined by everything, not just, how old I am, but the fact that I'm male, I'm white, I'm from the United States, that all factors into this stuff.
Right,
So
right.
that's, my definition of poetry is that, guys. It's the history of the human soul, which I thought was
Mhm.
great.
Really good definition. And I believe from what I've read through some of your poetry books,
Mm.
they are really coming from the heart. They speak your soul, as what you've just shared. Definitely something I can see. But at the same time, I'm curious though. The book you wrote, The Former Life,
Mhm.
um, what do you want to tell the readers in a general
I
term?
I think in general, I'm hoping, and I think, well, let me just say this. I think one of the best reviews I got, it's been reviewed fairly well,
Mm-hmm.
uh, but one of the best reviews is when I first started with the book. Um, I sent out a notice to all my friends and said, look, this book's coming out. If you want to pre-order, it will help me sell it and that sort of thing. So a bunch of my old high school friends and people I know now. But one of the guys I went to high school with, and I haven't seen this guy. Well, last time I saw him was our 45th reunion.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but he's living in Hawaii now. I've been here. I loved what he wrote. He said, you don't have to be an academic to enjoy this. In other words, he's an entomologist.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, so he works with insects. He's a biologist.
Mm-hmm.
And he says, I could still get it. I said, I did. And I thought that was a great compliment. And I'm hoping that's what people can do is read the book
Mm-hmm.
and get an insight into how I went through life and how I saw life. But
Mm-hmm.
also, I think good poetry should work at all sorts of levels. It's not just the hidden meanings. It's also what's on the surface. What can I understand just by reading this? And so
Oh.
that's what I hope people would take away from it is like, oh, so this guy experienced this or that or the other thing.
Mm-hmm.
Obviously, I have a 9/11 poem in there, which I wrote about.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, but most of them, it's funny, a lot of them, my family, obviously my son, he's got those two poems in there about him. My wife actually has two poems, although one doesn't seem to be about her, but it actually is. Um, because my wife was born on the same day as Barbie. I've always said I married Barbie. Uh,
Oh.
because her birth date is the exact same day that Mattel released the first Barbie dolls. Uh, so I said, yeah, you inspired that one. Um,
Interesting.
yeah, yeah. And then there's a poems about my father and that sort of thing, and just growing up, uh, being in the service, being a kid in New York, that sort of thing.
Okay. So
So
tell
it's all
us.
over the map.
Oh, you've lived a lot of places. I read about that. How
Oh
come
yeah.
you moved to so many
Oh,
places?
well, here again, when I worked in the ships,
Ah.
they would send us wherever the work is, and
Mm.
so yeah, I ended up. I was in the Virgin Islands for a while. I was spent a year in Baltimore. That's how I ended up in Florida. I was in New York. We got a
Mhm.
big job in Florida. We went down there, and after the job was done, the guy says, "Well, I'm moving the company down here." So okay, here we are. That was kind of a no-brainer for most of us because we're
Mm.
like, let's see, it's 80 degrees in January.
Mhm.
Uh, you have to shovel snow.
Oh
Uh,
gosh.
so,
Mm-mm. The travel, I believe, might have made you an old soul and had made you really write this emotionally connected book because going out to the readers and people who might want to read Bill's poetry books, this actually speaks to your soul a lot. And I find myself even close to tears from some of the um, poems that he's written. So I believe the travel, the intensity of the life you've lived may have made you the author that you are.
hmm.
I
Well, then here again, yeah, I wouldn't argue that at all.
Mhm.
And in fact, it's, the person I am. It's funny because you always get that question is if you could start over, what would you change? I'm going, I've screwed up a whole lot, but I don't know if I'd change it necessarily because it's what brought me to where I am now, and I'm pretty happy where I am now. So, you know,
Absolutely.
even the mistakes took me here. So,
Mhm. So, what do you think is the most significant poem that you've written?
oh God, good question. Jeez,
Mhm.
that's a tough one. Um, hmm, I don't know. That's, my Miles Davis poem, I think, is one of the more interesting ones because I'm one of those writers who I believe, look, the only way you write well is to just keep working at it. You have to keep revising it and re-editing it and going back to it. Miles Davis, I was always a big Miles Davis fan ever since I first heard him when I was in high school. And when he died,
Mhm.
I basically went to my room,
Mhm.
just put on all my Miles Davis recordings and just wrote notes and things. And I wrote this poem. And I've always said it's one of the few poems or one of the few pieces I've written where I didn't go through a lot of changes. That what I wrote the first time out, I like to call it one of the found pieces,
Mhm.
where what I wrote the first time came out pretty much. I mean, not to say it didn't go through revisions, but not anything major.
Mhm.
Uh, so that one, and then there's another one that went through that as well. It's called With Dad,
Mhm.
and it was right after my dad had died, and I was flying back after his memorial service,
Mhm.
and I just flashed on this one moment I had when I was waiting for the memorial
Mhm.
uh, that I wrote about it. I thought it came out pretty well, but so those two, and the Miles Davis one, though I think the Miles Davis, geez, that one is. I've gotten a lot of mileage out of it. A lot of people have published it. It's been nominated for push cards.
Oh wow.
I managed to get it in several anthologies as, this is my signature piece kind of thing. So that one, but it's really hard to say. I've had some, where people say, "Well, will you read this one?" Will you? The neighbor of mine,
Mhm.
loves the one I wrote once called Father's Day, which is
Mhm.
actually about the death of my mother, but it happened on Father's Day. So,
Oh,
um,
okay.
that one is, uh, geez, that's a tough question to answer because
Because most of it really
they're all
speaks
your
to you.
babies.
I agree. I agree. So, with this love for book poetry, do you see yourself ever writing other book genres?
Oh yeah, I'm absolutely. In fact, I'm in about halfway through. Well, it's funny because I focused on poetry as an undergrad. When I went to my master's,
Mm-hmm.
I was actually going to write a novel,
Mm-hmm.
but then the woman I was married to at the time relapsed into cancer. She ended up
Oh.
passing away. And so I took a semester off. When I came back, I said, no, forget the novel. I want to write a memoir about this, and dealing with terminal illness and that sort of thing. So I
Mm-mm-mm-mm.
wrote that, but I could never, it's funny because it was okay, but it wasn't good. It wasn't a very good book. And
I see.
I've
I
always
see.
wanted to get back to it. Well, as it turns out, I'm now about halfway through a book about my years in the Navy and on the ships,
Oh.
which I'm hoping will be done and ready to go out by hopefully April. That's what I'm sort of shooting for. And I was just talking to one of the guys in my writing group today, and I said, I think that once I'm done with this one, I'm going to be better able to go back to the other one that I'd written about my late wife and make the
Okay.
necessary changes
Mm.
because now I'm more willing to get in there and make the cuts that I need to make that really don't tell the story I need to tell. So yeah,
Mm.
I am working on. I mean, I've got another small book of poetry that's assembled, and I'm sending it out and hoping to get some bites.
Mhm.
I will probably get. I'm starting at the point where the newer material I've got in poetry will justify another full book. That's a ways down the road. Right
Mhm.
now, I'm focusing on this memoir of my life on ships,
Mhm.
which I have no idea what I'm going to call the thing.
Mhm.
Title's going to be, but it basically starts when I enlist in the Navy.
Mm-hmm.
go through that experience, get out, become a shipyard worker, and
Mm-hmm.
then get on the oil tankers. Uh,
Oh.
and that was about a 15-year period of my life. So
Mm.
it's been a lot of fun writing that up.
I see that. I can see that. So, with all this you talk about, tell us more about you. Who is Bill Cushing?
Well, geez. Uh, hmm. If I had to, well, I guess one thing I've always felt is I'm fairly responsible. I'm
Mhm.
relatively disciplined. I went to a military school when I was a kid, although I didn't. That discipline was a little late in coming, actually.
Mhm.
One of the reasons I ended up in the Navy was I got out of high school. I started college, like I said, as a journalism major, but I had a little too much fun my first semester.
Oh.
And they said, don't bother coming back. So,
Oh.
and of course, at the time, Vietnam was going on, and my draft number was fairly low. And I'm like, well, what do I do? And I said, well, I'll enlist in the Navy. My dad
Mhm.
was in the Navy. I come from a Navy family.
Mhm.
Um, but eventually, I got to the point where, yeah, I'm fairly disciplined, not entirely. I got my calls.
Mhm. Mhm.
Um, I don't know. I think probably the biggest thing, and this is one of the reasons I always felt I did fairly well when I taught college, was I really hate bullies. Uh,
Mhm.
and, and I always tell my students that you have to realize a teacher's in a pretty commanding position. You know, I've
Mhm.
got you guys here 3 hours a week.
Mhm.
I can say whatever I want, and if I want, you can't argue with me. And that's a pretty powerful position to be in. So I always like to keep that in perspective. A lot of it comes out of I grew up, you know, well, we've chatted a little bit about my son and handling
Mhm.
his disabilities, but my sister was also she has Down syndrome,
Oh,
and of course, growing up with that, I kind of
understood.
yeah,
And
I
knew
was
how
like
to work around it.
yeah,
Mm.
it was not hard to the only times I really got angry was when people would abuse her or take advantage of her,
Mm,
and
mm, mm,
uh,
mm, mm, mm,
so that when our son was born, it was like you know, my wife, of course, was very upset about everything. I said, look, there's far worse things to deal with.
mm.
Don't
Mhm.
worry about it. We'll get through it. But
Mhm.
it was not new territory to me.
Oh, okay, okay. Well, that's good to know about you. And lastly, why should people read this book? Uh, the one that were the former
Well,
life.
like I say, it is poetry, which puts a lot of people off. But I like to think it's an accessible form of poetry. Uh,
Mm.
and like I say, that's why when my friend said that from high school, says, "Hey, anybody can read this and understand it." You
Mhm.
know, even if he says even if I don't get the deeper meanings and all the illusions and
Mhm.
that sort of stuff, at
Mm-mm.
least I can say, yeah, I know this guy. It makes sense to me. And that's kind of like it was funny because when I started back at school and I was focused on poetry for my bachelor's,
Mhm.
my classmates used to call me the blue collar poet.
Mhm.
Uh, because I
Oh.
was writing about shipyards and bars and
Ah,
nightclubs and
okay.
things like that. Uh,
Mm-mm-mm-mm-mm.
so, I like to think yes, it's poetry and it follows that discipline, but it's relatively accessible. And
Mm.
I think that's the other thing with poetry. One of the things I like about it is that you can read the same piece over and over and get
Mhm.
new interpretations. And I think
Mhm.
that's
Mhm.
I've always argued, why do you think poetry books are so thin? They're not meant to be read once.
Right, right.
That's
I.
a kind of writing that's meant to be gone back to again and again.
Mhm. Well, that's good to know. But for me, and going out to the readers who might want to check out your book, this is really something that speaks to people's hearts. And I believe that reading it will put you in a zone of also trying to be insightful about your life. And I believe that that's who you are to me, and who I am becoming as well when I read your book. It puts me into that deep state of awareness,
Oh,
and it's a beautiful read.
thanks so much.
You're always welcome. We loved having you, and it was a pleasure.
Anytime. Thanks so much.
Thanks for listening to the Writera podcast. To learn more about today's guest or the key takeaways from this episode, visit www.writeramagazine.com.